Okay, today was known as Purim of Baghdad. And the reason why it was known as Purim of Baghdad is because the the Iraq was at that point controlled by the Persians, and the Persians were very bad to the Eden, and we know that from the Gemara. That the Persians were very, very bad to the Eden. So when the Ottomans came in, the Jews actually ganged up. They joined forces with the Ottomans to overthrow and to take over Baghdad. And the Sultan was Sultan Murad IV. In 1638, this Sultan, who was an Ottoman Turk, took over Baghdad, and that was very good for the Eden. And because of that, the Eden had something called Purim Baghdad. So that's number two. Is there was a famous American general who ended up becoming a president. His name was Ulysses Grant. Do you remember him from American history? So he was in the 1800s, and everybody knows the fight between the North and the South was over slaves, and people were smuggling cotton from the South and sending them to the North to the textile factories in the North, and they were being smuggled, and they weren't supposed to be smuggled. So right away, of course, everybody blamed the smuggling on the Jews. They're in the Shmata business, and they probably do the smuggling. So because of that, Ulysses Grant made an anti-Semitic decree, because it was done without any evidence, that no Jews are allowed to travel on the railroad. I guess it was Amtrak. I don't know what it was in those days. No Jews are allowed to travel south on the railroad, because he didn't want any Eden in the South. And that, of course, all the citizens of America were very happy to be machmer more than the stringency of the actual Gzeira. And not only didn't they let them go southbound on the train, they didn't let them go on the train at all, northbound or southbound. And any Jews that lived in the South were chased out, literally threatened with their lives. So imagine someone, after running away from the pogroms of Europe, shows up in America, the Golden Medina, and then he gets chased out of town in some southern town, and they couldn't even take the train. They had to walk with whatever they were able to carry and just walk north. This is in America.
A long walk to Miami, isn't it? Yeah.
But it wasn't good until a delegation of Eden met with the president, Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln right away sent out an order to Ulysses Grant that he must stop that practice immediately. But if you think here in America in the 1800s, it wasn't so much fun either. Okay, so let's see the Gemara weiter. Let's see the Gemara weiter. Ein Vein. Today's going to be a little bit of a difficult Gemara because we're going to be exposed to different sugyas, to Matahira, but Rashi helps us simplify it, so it should be pretty easy. Ein Vein. If someone says, Yankel, I'm not going to have any hanoah from you, or if someone says, Yankel, I'm not going to have any hanoah from you related to food, there's no really a difference in between them. Why? Because any hanoah that I can have from you that has value, I could then use to purchase food with. So for instance, I tell Yankel, I'm not going to have any hanoah from you. I'm not allowed to borrow his car, because you're having enough of him if you borrow his car. Borrowing someone's car doesn't give you any food. But since if you wanted to rent a car, it would cost you $60 a day. By renting his car, you're saving yourself $60. Now you have $60 that you can use to buy food with. And therefore, it doesn't make a difference if you have a blanket Isser Hanoah or an Isser Hanoah only related to food, it's all the same. Why? Because any benefit that you'd have can be transferred into a cash value that then could be used to buy food. Unless we find certain hanos that couldn't be transferred to a cash value. Zok the Mishnah Ella, what cannot be transferred into a cash value? Ella Drizis Haregel, the Kalim She'ein Oishin B'Moichel Nefesh. Drizis Haregel is stepping into his property when no one would ever pay for such a thing. So that's having a no from him because you're using his property, but that will not translate into you being able to acquire any type of food. And Kalim She'ein Oishin B'Moichel Nefesh. If you want to borrow a knife from him, or if you want to borrow a lawnmower from him, that's something that can't translate into food unless people rent those things out. And then weiter, it's going to translate into money. We're talking about kelim that nobody would rent out, nobody would charge for. So therefore, it's considered hana, but it's not considered hana of oichel nefesh. Zok the Gemara, hol any kelim she'oisin ben oichel nefesh, zev is a shoven. Any kelim, even if you wouldn't pay for it, but it's a kelim that can be used to make food with, like a fork or a knife or a kitchen utensil, even though there's no cash value to it, it would be usher to borrow that from your friend if you ashered hanos oichel nefesh on yourself from him, or if you ashered any hana from him. Drisas haregel, frektimor drisas haregel has no value at all. Holoi kapti, inchi, people are makbid. And the Gemara is asking, Rashi explains, that even if you were muder menu hana, any type of hana, stepping into his property is no hana at all. It has zero value to it at all. Omarava, you're right. But Hamani Rabbi Eliezer, this Mishnah is following the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer, Damar Vitor Asher B'Muder Hana. Even something that people aren't makbar on at all. As Rashi says to the right, Dover Shahayim Avater L'chol Adam, Ve'ini makbar Adam. If anybody stepped onto his property, he wouldn't protest, he would have no problem with it. So you might say that's completely valueless. Nevertheless, if you've assured yourself to have a no from somebody, you're not allowed to take from him even things that he doesn't care if anybody takes. Zok the Heilige Mishnah weiter. Ein ben nedarim l'nedabis. When there's through a shul, because that's not covered for the besmedrash. That has nothing to do with having enough from somebody. A shortcut through a shul is not covered for the besmedrash. It's not covered for besmedrash to use it as a shortcut. But that's not a question of isra or no. If it's about taking the shortcut through someone's property, well, if someone has no problem, he's not makbid, and he lets everybody walk through his property, that would not be usher tamud or hana, unless you have like Rabbi Eliezer. Then you have the kids who are always running through your yard. You are makbid, and no matter what you say, they come anyway. That's a different story. Okay, Zok Tehillah Gemara. Especially if you have a shul, if your backyard neighbor has a shul, then your house becomes a pathway, right, David?
Well, yes, right.
If your backyard neighbor has a shul, then your house automatically becomes the 401. Zok to Gemara. There's no difference between nedarim and nedavos. Now we already know, the Gemara is going to tell us, but we already know that another is if someone says harei olai oila, I'm accepting upon myself to bring a carbon oila. A nedava is someone says harei zu oila, I'm making this animal into an oila. The difference is obvious. If I said harei olai oila, my responsibility is not discharged till that oila is brought. But if I say harei zu oila, my responsibility is discharged instantly because this animal is an oila. If something happens to it, it's not my oila that got damaged, it's the oila of the Beis HaMikdash that got damaged. So Zok the Mishnah, ein bein nedarim l'nedavos, there's no difference between nedarim and nedavos, ella shanedarim chayav b'achriusa. If you said harei olai oila, you're chayav b'achrius, like I illustrated a moment ago, because your responsibility has not been discharged until you've delivered that carbon and it was hukra. But in the nedavos ein chayav b'achriusa, simply because you've discharged your responsibility the moment you set aside that animal. Zok to Gemara, that you have to bring your karbanos in within a certain amount of time, otherwise you're over a nisr. And we learned to sugya bal ta'achar, if it's 3 regalim, that starts with Pesach, if it's 1 regel, if it's sukkos, if it's Pesach, there were a lot of different shittas as to what triggers it. So Rashi says, "Halini bal ta'achar." The alfagav, the nedava, the kra, the baltacha loksiva. In fact, Rashi, when the Torah discusses this about Acher, the Torah is not even discussing the Dovas there. The Torah is only discussing the Dorim. So maybe that should be an additional difference between the Dorim and the Dovas, because we should say that Baal Tacher does not apply to the Dovas. So to Gemara, so Rashi Marbin and Leib Meseches Rosh Hashanah Megzer Shava. We had a Gzer Shava in Meseches Rosh Hashanah that clearly tells us that the Isra Baal Tacher applies equally to the Dorim as it does to the Dovas. So Halil Baal Tacher is Zev is Hashem. They're both the same. Before I go weiter in the Gemara, I just want to go to the Tosfos, because Tosfos asks a very good kasha, because Tosfos identifies many, many differences that exist between the Nedarim and the Dovas. So why is the Mishnah saying that there are no differences other than a Chiyuv Achrayis? So let's have a look, and some of them we're very familiar with. So I'm looking at Tosfos, which is the third Tosfos on the Amud. Kosher Frek Tosfos. Amai Loitani, why didn't the Mishnah offer other differences? Shenadava ba min meiser. If you bring in a dava, you're allowed to take meiser and say harezu nedava. Tichsiv is avakta shlomim gabi meiser. The nether ain't ba elam nachulin. If someone says harei alai oila, he's not allowed to take from meiser. He has to use cash money for that. V'chivin dom harei alai have a nether. So for Tosfos, this is an obvious difference between nether and nedava, whether or not you can bring it to meiser. So why didn't the Mishnah list that off as well as a difference between nether and nedava? We're not talking in our Mishnah about a general category. What's the difference between that and another? Our Mishnah is referring to, I have two animals side by side. One of them I designated for my Harei Alai Oila, and one animal was Harei Zu Oila. And on these two animals specifically, the Mishnah is asking, what's the difference? So the Mishnah can't offer us a difference if you could bring it from Meiser, because I have the animal here already. It's already separated. So it's not a question anymore of what I can use to be Mekayim my nether. Rather, we're discussing now that I have these two animals, the difference would only be if it's Chayiv B'Achrayis or not. Okay, so let's see the Gemara Vayter. Tanan Hasam, one line after the Gemara on Chesam Adal. Ezo nether. What is a nether? Ha'omer Harei Olai Oil. Someone who says, I'm accepting upon myself, upon my person, to bring a carbon oil. I'm not accepting anything upon myself. I'm just designating this animal to be a carbon oil. Nedarim, if you said Allah, you accept it upon yourself. Then meso and nignavu, if the animal died, or the animal was stolen, or yovdu, if the animal got lost, the person who accepted upon himself this obligation still has to provide another animal. But Nedavais, if he only designated this animal as a carbon, then Mesu, I Nignavu, I Avdu, if something happened to the animal, how do I know this halacha? In fact, that Nedavais are not chayiv in achrayis, while Nedarim are chayiv in achrayis. The Tanu Rabbanan, we have another brayso. It says, V'nir tzaloi l'chaper alav. So let's look at the pasuk. V'samech yodeh al reisha oila, v'nir tzaloi l'chaper alav. It's speaking about an oilus nedava, and it's telling us that v'nir tzaloi l'chaper alav. What are we dashing from here? Reb Shimon tells us, es she'alav, if something is upon you, it's a responsibility that's on your person, then chayiv b'achrayusoi, only then will you be chayiv on its achrayus if it gets damaged or lost. But if it's not incumbent upon you, then you're not mechuyev in its achrayus. There's a famous Telzer chiluk. They say, is it in the gaver or is it in the chefza? Right? So if harei lies, it's in the gaver. There's a chiv upon you. So therefore, no matter what happens to the animal, you have a chiv. But if it's in the chefza, if the animal is kaddish, but you have no obligation, like in the case of a rezu, einay chayev b'achrayus. My mashma, how do you see from olav anything about if the chiv is on you or not? Once someone said harei alai oila, command the ton akas vedomi. When someone uses the word harei alai, that's an expression of accepting a personal responsibility upon myself to make sure that the carbon gets delivered and gets properly processed. Zok the Mishnah. Now we're getting into ziva. Ein ben zav haroyish teriyos l'royish shalosh ala carbon. So this is a little bit unfamiliar territory, even though we're slightly familiar with ziva, but zav is a little bit different. So one of the differences between a zav, a male, and a zav, a female, is a zav is only considered a zav gedola if she sees 3 consecutive days, and she has to see each riyah on a different day. If she saw 3 times on the same day, that's considered 1 riyah. By men, it doesn't work that way. A man who sees ziva 3 times in the same day or 2 times in the same day, that adds up. So the Torah tells us that a man who sees ziva 2 days is tummy for 7 days. He's metama mishka v'moishav, which means if he's a princess like Cinderella and he lies on 10 mattresses, the pee that's underneath the 10th mattress that he didn't even touch will become tummy, right? Again, where do you think he got Cinderella from? It's for sure from Mishka V'Moshe, right? All the creative, what we do is we're giving these creative authors a lot of credit because we're saying they probably knew the Gemaras. Or maybe one day in Shir, when their Rebbe was talking about it, they were chuluming, and they heard that was something about 10 mattresses, and they chulum their own thing. But everything is inspired from the Gemara. So Ein Ben Zav Arayis Teriyos L'Royis Shalish. So a Zav who saw twice has all of the Chumras and Tumah as a Zav who saw 3 times.
Do we know what a Zav really is? What exactly is the what am exactly? Yeah.
Well, let's put it this way. I've never seen it, and even if I had, I wouldn't tell you.
Yeah, but is it's not semen, and
No, it's not.
it's some kind of a flowing liquid discharge, right? But what is it, and what makes it tummy exactly?
Yeah, the Torah says that it causes tumah, but I'm not sure what it is.
Gonorrhea.
It's gonorrhea? Who says it's gonorrhea?
I've seen that translated as gonorrhea.
Oh, really? Well, I
Isn't
don't
it
have
also-
gonorrhea.
That's gonorrhea is a disease.
Yeah, it's definitely a sickness. It's definitely a sickness, but I don't know what it is. I do not know what it is. And like I said, anybody who does won't share it with us. So I'm sorry? No, because it's like a ruchnis, it's like tsaras, like it's a ruchnistic type of disease. So we don't have it anymore. So Zoktamor, actually, our Rebbe in Cheder always taught us the reason why we don't have tsaras because we're such a low madrega. So today, if someone got tsaras, it would mean he's very holy and he's zoichet to such a oynish. So maybe someone who had ziva should run around publicizing it. But I don't know if that would happen. No, it only comes from no, but it means from a specific place. Yeah, it didn't want to.
Yeah, but gonorrhea is sexually
doesn't mean wax out of his ear.
gonorrhea is a sexually transmitted disease. I think a Zav, you don't have to have any transmission.
That's right. Okay, so let's see what the Gemara says here. So there's no difference between a Zav who's a 2 riyas to a Zav who's a 3 riyas carbon. Their status and Tumah are identical. The only difference is that someone who had 3 riyas has to bring a carbon. He must bring a carbon. Zok to Gemara, Hala Inyan Mishkav Moshe, Lagabi the Allah of Mishkav Moshe, which means that it can be Mitama, the Zav who's on a bed will be Mitama, anything underneath that bed, or Severe Shiva, the fact that he needs 7 clean days to become Tor from his Tumah, Zev is Shavin, they both have the same status. Let's see Rashi. Rashi describes what it means in Tumas Mishkav Moshe. Shochav or Yoshav al Gabay Asor Begadim Ze al Ze. What happens if you sat on 10 begadim? I changed that to 10 mattresses. You have 10 mattresses piled up, or 10 sheets on one mattress, and you sat on the top sheet. Kulan Avoy Satumah. They're not just original tumah. Now let's remember, a Zov is an avatumah. If he just touches something, it makes it into a rishon. But if he sits on something, if he puts his weight on something, that makes it into an av, which means it gives it the same status as tumah as he himself has. That's a very big chiddush. Normally, as you transmit tumah, it loses its potency and it goes down levels, right? An av makes a rishon makes a sheni. But when this av tumah the zav sits on begodim, he puts his weight on begodim, or anything else that he puts his weight upon, it retains the same level of tumah as he has, and even if he didn't touch it. So even if he's sitting on 10 sheets, all of those 10 sheets become an av tumah. What if he just touched something? Then it would only be a rishon, and therefore the mitama adam mekalim. A rishon tumah cannot be mitama a person, because the lowest level of tumah that a person can have is rishon. So therefore, if a person touches an av, he'll become a rishon. But if a person touches a rishon, he doesn't become tamei at all. The same thing goes with kalim. If you have a cup that touches a rishon, it does not become tamei, because it can only become a rishon. And the only types of things that can take on a tumah from a rishon, in other words, that can become a sheni, or oichel namashkin. So the chiddush of Mishkav Moshe is a twofold chiddush. A is that it becomes tumah even though you didn't touch it, and B is it takes on the same level of tumah as the zav itself. So that's the first That's the first example of something where even a Zov or Shtei Riyos has that serious Tuma, and there's Sphere Shiva, which means Misha Yivsak, even once the Zov stops having these emissions, he's not instantly tar, rather Tzorach Limnoi Zayin Nekiyim Kodim Shiyitva. Before he tables the mikveh, he has to count 7 days of clean, means no emissions. If he sees Ziva, even on the 7th day, he's back to square one. And Rashi says the Gemara is specifically looking for the Shavan Latuma, Vein Shavan Lakarban. So basically, everything is being challenged. How do we know that a Zav of 2 years, that of 3 years, are the same Lagabi Tuma? And how do we know that they're not the same Lagabi Karban? The Tanur Rabban, Rab Simoi Omar, Rab Simoi says, Mona Hakas of Shtayim, Vikari Tamai, and Shalish Vikari Tamai. There's 2 times in the Torah where the Torah discusses Ziva. And in one case, the Torah repeats the word Ziva twice and says he's Tamei. And in another pasuk, the Torah repeats the word Ziva 3 times and says that he's Tamei. Now let's see the examples. And Rashi offers us these examples. Mona Akasav Shtayim. It says in Parashas Tazria, the Ish Kiyeh Zav Mi B'Sayrai. So it says Zav once. Zayvai Tamehu. So here's a pasuk that has the word Ziva mentioned twice, and it says you're Tamei. In this pasuk, we have 2 zivos mentioned, and the Torah calls them tamei. We have another pasuk that's shalosh v'kari tamei. It says also in Parashas Tazria, v'zois tia temasa b'zoivoi. So that's zoivoi number 1. Roar b'sari as zoivoi number 2. I hechtim b'sari b'zoivoi number 3. Harelach shalosh. We have 3 mentions of ziva in the pasuk v'kari tamei temasai. So, haketzat. So, how do you decipher this? And Rashi says there's a little bit of a problem because imishtayim tamei lama part locha kasav sholish. If someone is already tamei, once he has 2 re'iyos, why would the Torah give an example of someone becoming tuma when he has 3 re'iyos? Haketzat zok gemara shtayim l'tuma. It's telling you that if someone sees Ziva twice, he has all of the halachas of tuma that a zov has. V'sholish l'karban. But if he sees a 3rd time, it adds an additional dimension that now he has to bring a carbon. Frank the Gemara, is that the only way that you can decipher these 2 psukim? How about I suggest an alternative? Maybe if you see 2 re'iyos, you're tamei and you don't bring a carbon. And shalosh, if you have 3 re'iyos, l'karban v'lo l'tama. Maybe then you're mechuyev a carbon, but you're not tamei anymore. Now that's not logical, and the Gemara right away jumps on that. Amrit actually rosh shalosh rosh tayim. By the time you saw 3, you saw 2. So why would the fact that you saw a 3rd time undo the tumah that you've already contracted when you saw the 2nd time? And that's what Rashi says rosh tayim. From the fact that you had a 3rd re'iyah, why should that remove your tumah? So that's not a logical option. Zok the Gemara, but I have another option that might be logical. Maybe the 2nd riyah doesn't trigger tumah. Maybe it triggers carbon. You're assuming that it's easier to contract tumah than to be mechayiv a carbon. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe after you saw your 2nd riyah, you're mechayiv a carbon, but you're not tumah yet. And shalosh, the 3rd riyah triggers afla tumah. Zok to Gemara, that's not an option. That's not mistaber. You know why? Because we have another pasuk. It says in the pasuk, the chiper hakayin, the chiper olav hakayin lefnei Hashem mizoyvoy. The koyin, when he brings the karbonis, will be mechaper upon the zov from his zoyvoy. Now mizoyvoy means from part of its ziva, and that's what we're focusing on. Mizoyvoy from part of its zoyvoy. So therefore, we darshan mix asas zovin maviin carbon. Only some of the zovin are mechuyev to bring a carbon. Mix zovin ain't maviin carbon. But some zovin don't bring a carbon. So how could we decipher which zov brings a carbon and which one doesn't? Logic would dictate, haketzad rosh shalosh, if the zov saw 3 re'iyos, then maybe he'll bring a carbon. But shtayim, if he only saw 2, einoi maybe he wouldn't bring. So since we have a pasuk that seems to indicate that a carbon is only brought for some zovin, let's say this some zovin are the ones who saw even a 3rd time. But if you only saw a 2nd time, then you wouldn't bring a carbon. Zok to Gemara, there's another way to look at this. Maybe raw base, if you saw 2 re'iyos, maybe you bring a carbon. Rosh Shalosh, and maybe. It says Mizayvai, some Zavim bring a carbon, some don't. So why are you saying if you saw 3 times you bring, and you saw 2 times you don't bring, maybe the opposite. Maybe if you say 2 you bring, and if you saw 3 you didn't bring. Zaktamar, that's not logical at all. Amrit actually Rosh Shalosh, Rosh time. The moment you saw 2, you already had a chi of carbon triggered. So the fact that you saw a 3rd time, you want to suggest that to patter you from the carbon, that's not logical either. So therefore, we needed a combination of 2 different psukim to teach us this. We needed the mizoivoi to tell you that only some zovim bring a carbon and not all. And we also need the fact that there's 2 psukim, one because of shtayim v'karei tamei and one because of sholish v'karei tamei. We actually, in order to come to our conclusion that Tumah is at 2 and carbon is at 3, we need a combination. We need a combination of forces of Rabbi Simoi's drasha and the pasuk of Zayvai. Why is that? The midi Rabbi Simoi. If we only had Rabbi Simoi's halacha to tell us manakas of shtayim v'kari tamei and manakas of sholish v'kari tamei, having a kukushon, I would have thought like our kasha. And what was our kasha? That at 3 you bring a carbon and Tumah doesn't get triggered. At 2 you bring a carbon and Tumah doesn't get triggered until 3. Therefore, you needed mizayvai to tell us that not everybody brings a carbon. Some people don't. Kamashla mizayvai. Mizayvai. If you only had the pasuk mizayvai, which tells you that some of them bring a carbon, some don't, we wouldn't know how many re'iyos you need to have to bring the carbon. Lo yadana kama re'iyos. Maybe I need 6 re'iyos to bring a carbon. So therefore you need Reb Simoi's halacha, Kamashla Reb Simoi, that there's the 2 and there's the 3. If you know there's a 2 and you know there's a 3, you know something's triggered at 2 and something's triggered at 3. And we know that not all Zovin bring a carbon, it would be logical to say that at 2, Tumah gets triggered, and at 3, the chi of carbon gets triggered. The Hashad Amrit Mizayvai Ladrasha, now that you're telling me when it says the word Mizayvai, you don't read it plain that the coin is Matar, this person from a Ziva. Rather, you kvetch down a little deeper and you say Mizayvai, not all Zovin are Mechuyev and Karbanis. Well, then there's other psukim that say mizayvai, and now you're going to have to come up with a drasha for those as well. It says later on, the chiyiter hazav mizayvai, when the zav becomes tar from a ziva. My darshaspe, what are you going to darshan from there? What partial thing is there over there to discuss? So that mizayvai we need to teach us a different drasha. It says as follows: the chiyiter hazav l'cheshayivsoik mizayvai. So the pasuk. And let's see the pasuk inside because it's telling us what gets triggered at that point. It says when the zav becomes tar from a ziva. So what gets triggered? He has to count 7 nikiyim, and after he counts 7 nikiyim, he washes his clothing, and he goes to the mikveh, the tar, and it'll be tar. So basically, once he stops seeing, he needs 7 nikiyim. So what do we learn from there? Zok to Gemara as follows. The chiyiter azav l'chashiyif soik mizayvai when the ziva stops, but it says mizayvai. So what does it mean mizayvai? So Gemara v'loy mizayvai v'nigel. And Rashi tells us, what if a person has double trouble? Not only is he a zav, but he also has tsaras. And what happened is his tsaras is still there, which means he cannot become tar, but his ziva stopped. So do you start counting shiva nikiyim, or say I'm tamei anyway because of my ziva, because of my tsaras? Why bother? So zokt the pasuk over mizayvai v'loy mizayvai v'nigai, even though you still have a nega and you cannot count your shiva nikim from your nega, nevertheless, since your ziva stopped, right away you can start counting the shiva nikim for the ziva. And let's see Rashi on the very first wide line. V'loy mizayvai v'nigai shem haya zav u'mitzayir. If this guy had double trouble, u'pasuk mizayvai and his ziva stopped, but v'loy nisrapa adayin v'nigai, but he still had his nega. So we say v'siper, right? Mizayvai v'siper, you should still count. Ein oimim loy, we won't tell him ein svirazu nikiyas achi yider afminigai. We're not going to say that this counting of shiva nikiyim for ziva is nothing because it's not called nikiyim if he still has a nega. Rather, no. Elamayna v'oilach miyat, you can start counting immediately shiva nikiyim for your ziva. V'oila loy l'svirazoy, and that will count. Now he's still not completely tar. However, when eventually he does become healed from taras, then yitpel miyat fil rishon nishol mitzara. he'll right away be able to go to the mikvah, because the Mitzvah can go to the mikvah once he becomes healed. That tefillah will work both for his nega and for his ziva. And what will that accomplish? The nitar milatame mishka v'moshav. That'll take away his tumah mishka v'moshav that a zav normally has, as well as the tumah that if he moves a klicheres, it becomes tameh kedin zav. So at least it removes all of the chomer tumah that only applies to a zav and not to someone who has saras. Nevertheless, even though he's not completely tar, because he still needs shiva nakim for his saras, and that shiva nakim and the tefillah afterwards is going to allow him to eat karbanos. Nevertheless, ahani tefillah kamaisa, this first tefillah that he made after his shiva nakim that he counted when he was a zav, even though he's still a mitzvah, it helps l'tairai militama mishka v'moshe v'chucheres b'hesed. So the severe tumas that only apply to a zav and not to a mitzvah, those he can deal with right away, and his severe counts. Zok Gemara limit al zav. Then it says v'siper. V'siper limit al zav bal shtei riyos. If a zav only had 2 riyos, shatan severe shiva, he also has to count shiva nakim. Which is like our Mishnah said, and being zav l'mitzayir, and means zav al shtei zav al shalosh riyos, ella carbon. But as far as the sphere shiva, it applies to a zav of 2 riyos. Fact more about leidinu. Why do I need a pasuk for it? Imetama mishka v'moishav. If the zav bal shtei riyos is metama mishka v'moishav, like we're saying, lo yehei ton sphere shiva, so it should also require sphere shiva. Because if it's a tumah chamura requires a severe shiva. So why do I need a pasuk of mizoy v'sipar to include someone who saw ziva twice that needs severa? I should be able to know that from svara, from logic. You don't know that from svara, from logic. You know why? Because I'll show you someone who has tumah chamura yet does not count shiva nekiyim. A woman who saw ziva one day, she is metame tumah chamura mishkav kamoishav. Yet she doesn't need shiva nekiyim. She metame mishkav kamoishav ve'ena tuna svira shiva. Therefore, v'afata al tatama al zeh. Therefore, a zav who saw 2 re'iyos shaf al pisha metame mishkav kamoishav, even though he's metame mishkav kamoishav, lo yehitan svira shiva. You would not know from logic that he requires shiva nekiyim. Talmud lamer mizoyvay v'siper. That's why we need a pasuk of mizoyvay v'siper to tell you that a zav bal shtei re'iyos, even if it's mizoyvay, even if he only saw 2 re'iyos, nevertheless v'siper, he still needs shiva nekiyim. Miksa zoyvay v'siper limid al zav bal shtei re'iyos shatan sviras shiva. So now we have a massive problem, because from the same pasuk of mizoyvay, from one pasuk of mizoyvay, we learned that you only bring a carbon, only some zavim bring a carbon, not all bring a carbon, right? So we're excluding a zav bal shtei re'iyos from bringing a carbon. From the second mizoyvay, we said, even though it's not a full ziva, it's only a part ziva, you're included in the tumas shiva. So does mizoyvay come to be marba, a zav of shtei re'iyos, like we're using it for shifir shiva, or does mizoyvay only some zivas? Do we use that to exclude the zav of shtei re'iyos, like we say by karbanos? You can't have it both ways. It's the same limit of mizoyvay. Does it include the zav shtei re'iyos? Is it inclusive of even a part ziva, or is it exclusive? It's saying no. If you're a part ziva, you don't bring a carbon. How could you dash in both ways? It's 2 different psukim, but it's the same word used in each of the psukim. Right? The Gemara said, now that you're dashing mizoyvay here, you have to be dashing mizoyvay there. So it's the same mizoyvay. What's the difference? Mizoyvay. Only some ziva have this chumrah, not others. By carbon, we say only some ziva have the chumrah of carbon, not others. So mizoyvay, only some zivas have the chumrah of sphere shiva, not others. So Amalei Rapapa Labaya Maishna Haimizoyvay, the Marbile Zav Bal Shtei Re'iyos, which is Lagabe sphere shiva. Maishna Haimizoyvay, the Memayit Be Zav Bal Shtei Re'iyos, and you're saying that they don't bring a carbon. Amalei Isol Kadaitach Hailamutehu. Let's say that the second mizoyvay is also being memayit, and it's saying that a zav al shtei re'iyos does not need shiva nekiyim. So, if you hold that's what it's doing, lishtek kramine, the pasuk shouldn't have said anything at all. It just should have a suffer law. It shouldn't have said Mizoivai. We know we're talking about a Zov. And I would have automatically known that a Zov Asterish is not included, because why should it be included? If you're going to tell me he'd be included anyway, because Asya Medina, you learn it from a Kavachomer, like the Mar just tried it at the bottom of Amud Beis, at the bottom of Amud Aleph, going on to Amud Beis, that wouldn't work because Shemer is Yom Keneged Yom Techiyah. So we didn't need the Torah to tell me anything. The Torah could have said nothing, and then I wouldn't have had any reason to believe that a Zav Bal Shtei Riyos requires Svira. So therefore, the fact that the Torah is stuck in the extra Mizoibe that's not necessary, it's changing the default and saying that it would a Zav Bal Shtei Riyos would require Svira Shiva. Maybe you need Mizoibe for something else, not to teach you that a Zav Bal Shtei Riyos counts 7 Akiyim, rather Mizoibe. Maybe you need it for that. Zakta Gemara, that's not a raya, because in Kain lichted kra the chiyiter azov. The Torah should have said the chiyiter azov. So let's see Rashi. I'm sorry, that's right. In Kain lichted kra the chiyiter azov. Boy mizoivai. I'm sorry, 1 second. The Gemara uses mizoivai, the loy mizoivai nigai, to tell you that you can still count. Right, so maybe that's what the mizoivah. Maybe let's use the mizoivah for that. Let's use the second one for that, and we won't use it to teach you. We won't use it to teach you Yid Shiva Nakim. Zaktamar Imkain Lichtov Kra the Chayiter Azov. All the pasuk had to say was the Chayiter Azov, the Lishtak, and not say anything else. Mizoivah Lamali. Why did it stick in the word Mizoivah? Limit Azov by Shteriyosh Shaitan Svira Shiva. So you're asking is that we used Mizoivah Vilay Minigai from the first one. Let me see. I don't know if that's true. The Chiyita Azov Mizoivah. No. The Zoivah where we learned to be marbe the carbon was Mizoivah that we weren't using from Mizoivah Vilay Minigai. Mizoivah Vilay Minigai is what we use the second pasuk of Mizoivah for, which is the one that we're discussing. So the Gemara here is asking.
One of them is teaching us
Right.
One of them is teaching us about Torah.
Correct. But the pasuk of Mizoivah V'Loi V'Nigai, from there we're also learning that a Zav Bal Shtei Riyos requires Sfira Shiva. So the Gemara here is asking, you have two limudim that you can extract from the pasuk of Mizoivah, the second Mizoivah. A is that Mizoivah V'Loi V'Nigai, and you have Mizoivah that a Zav Bal Shtei Riyos needs Shiva Nakiyim. So
What's the Mizoivah Laminigai?
No, Mizoivah V'Loi V'Nigai means is that you could start the process of the hire on a Zav, even Bal Shalosh Riyos, even though he still might be a Mitzvah. How do you know that even a Zav Bal Shtei Riyos needs Shiva Nakiyim? So that's the other limit of Mizoivah V'Siper. So we're actually learning two different things. A, we're learning that you can start Shiva Nakiyim from Ziva, even though you're still a Mitzvah. And B is Mizoivah V'Siper, even though you're not a full Zav, you're only a part of, you still have to count Shiva Nakiyim. So the Gemara asks, maybe use this pasuk only for one drasha. How do you know you can extract two drashas from this?
One's for 2 and one's for 3.
Say that again.
Both will teach us Mizoivah Laminigai. One is for 2 and one is for 3.
No, maybe there's only one lima to be extracted from here. It says v'chiyiter hazav mizoivah v'siper. When the zav becomes tar from his ziva, then he starts counting Shiva Nakiyim. So maybe we only learn one thing from here. That when the Zav becomes Torah from Ziva, even though he's still Tamei, Machmas Saras, he could still do V'Siper. The Gemara is trying to make this into 2 Lamutim. Mehechatesh, it's 2 Lamutim. Maybe it's only 1 limit. Right? The Gemara wants to learn 2 things out of here. Sai that Mitzvah can count Shiva Nakiyim for his Ziva, and Sai that even a Zav Bal Shtei Riyos needs Shiva Nakiyim. Who said? Maybe there's only 1 limit to be harnessed. To be harvested from this pasuk. So the Gemara wants to illustrate. No, there's actually too many extra words, because in Kain lichtav krav yichiter azov. If the Torah would have said the chiter azov v'siper, I would have known the chiter azov v'siper. If the zav become tar, even though he's still a mitzayra, he can still count. So I have that limit. The word mizoivah is completely extra to teach you that even a zav al shtei riyos requires Shiva Nakiyim. The Chiter Azov, the Lishtaik Mizoivai, the pasuk didn't have to say the word Mizoivai at all. Lamali, the extra word Mizoivai is Limad Al Zav Bal Shtei Riyosh Shatan Svir Shiva. that tells you that a Zav who saw 2 Riyos still has to count Shiva Nakiyim. So at the end of the day, we know that a Zav Bal Shtei Riyos count Shiva Nakiyim from Yosy. We know that it's Matama Mishkav Kemosh of Tumah Chamura because of Rab Simoy's halacha that the Torah counted 2 Zivas and said Tamei, 3 Zavas and became Tamei, to tell you that the 2 Zivas become Tamei in Gansen, and the 3rd Ziva tells you that you're also Mechuyev in the carbon. We also learned that if someone is a Zav and a Metzora and the Ziva heals, he can start counting the Shiva Nakim for his Ziva, even though he's still a Metzora. I'm sorry? No, he cannot bring any carbon till he's healed from the Tzaras. The Tefillah, that's Hiltayt. And that's actually, that's how Rishon Rashi says Hiltayt.
If they both feel at the same time,
Of course.
then will become the vote.
That's right. It's called concurrent sentences.
So that would be a privilege itself, no?
Why would that be a chiddush? Being clean is being clean. I don't have Tzaras and I don't have Ziva.
So you've got 2 levels.
There's 2 things happening at the same time. I don't have Tzaras and I don't have Ziva. So I don't think the problem is overlapping. So let's see the Gemara Vayter. Ein being Mitzvah Muskar, L'Mitzvah Muchlet. Again in Parshas Tezria, it talks about a Mitzvah. A Mitzvah, during his process, if he doesn't have all of the Simonim of Tumah right away in his first exhibition, then he's locked up for 7 days. And during those 7 days, if it spreads, he'll be Tamei and Gansen. If it shows some other Simon Tumah, becomes Tamei. Otherwise, he actually gets locked up for a second week. So it says, there's no difference in Tumah and anything between the Mitzvah Muskar, who's not condemned yet, he's still under observation, to a Mitzvah who's already condemned, Elapriya Ufrima. And it says in the pasuk about Sarura Shabbat Anega, the Gadav Yufrumim, his begun should be torn, the Rashi of Harua, and his hair should be long, Basvasam Yata, the Tame Yikra. So he has to sit by Velas out of the Machana, and he has to say, Tame, I'm Tame. So that only applies to a Mitzvah Muchlet, who was condemned. But a Mitzvah who's still under observation doesn't have to do that. But as far as how Tame they are, they're exactly the same. That's the first halacha that the Mishnah says. The second halacha that the Mishnah says is Ein bein tor mitoch hesker. What happens if someone was under observation and then he was exonerated? So they let him free. So he became tar. He was tarmei up until now, and now he's tar. Or somebody was actually condemned as a real mitzvah, and then he got healed, and then he became tar. There's no difference between the process of how each of them become tar. That the mitzvah muchlet has to have his head shaved, and he has to bring carbonates of birds that the mitzvah of Hesker does not have to do. Look tomorrow. Halini shaluach. Lagabe the alocha that these mitzvahs have to be out of the machna. The tumah and the fact that they're all tumah. Rashi says kol chomer tumah hamur b'mitzvah. All of the chomers of tumah that apply to a mitzvah, zev is a shavin. Both a muskar and a muchlat will be the same. Mina hanamili. How do we know that? And Rashi says specifically, how do you know that a mitzvah muskar doesn't need priya and prima? We know that a mitzvah muskar has all the halachas of tumah of a mitzvah muchlat. Maybe he should also need priya and prima. He should also need to tear his clothes and let his hair grow long. How do we know that he's exempt from that? The Tani Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Kamed Rabhuna. It says v'tihari hakoyen mispach asi v'chibes begodav v'tah. It says v'tihari hakoyen mispach asi v'chibes begodav v'tah. This is speaking about a mitzvah who didn't have to become muchlat. He became healed while he was still under observation. So let's look at the pasuk inside. So this is someone who was muskar for a second week period, but he was still under observation. He wasn't tamei condemned. And to his good fortune, the nega got lighter, and it didn't spread. Therefore, now the word v'tar means, and he is already tar. It doesn't say the chibis begadav, he should wash his clothing, be yitar, and then he'll become tamei. Because he already is tamei. How does that work? So back into the Gemara, tar mi priya prima de meikara. The tar means not that he becomes tar now, he was always tar. From what was he tar always? We know he was tamei. So it must be that he was tar from the halacha of priya uprima. So from this vitar, which has a connotation of in the past, not in the future, it tells us that there was something different about this muskar from a standard mitzvah muchlat, and that is that we say that would be that he's exempt from priya and prima. Amalei Rava, Elamayata. Now that you're saying that the word v'taher always means something in the past, I'm going to find you other psukim that say v'taher, and how are you going to translate those things into something from the past? Elamayata gabizov dechsiv v'chibes begod v'taher. And this pasuk is talking about after Azov becomes tahar, in what way is Azov tahar lumafreya? How are you going to explain something retroactively by the Zov? What type of retroactive tar could you possibly be referring to? Ella, you're going to have to say that tar hashda militamek licheres behesit afagav da dechaze loy mitamal mafreya. So I'm not sure if we should get into this because it's already getting close to davening time. So let's stop here, and we'll have to be behind. I can't believe this happened to me. That we're actually behind now by a half a Amud after Eich Naflu Giborim. We were ahead by a blot, and now we're behind by a half Amud. But it is a little bit of a complicated Gemara. So we'll start tomorrow at Ein Bein Mitzvah Muskar and Mitzvah Muchlut. We'll start from there, and hopefully we'll be able to move a little bit faster tomorrow. So,
Yeah.